So anyway, let's launch into the gospel here. Actually, we're going to start recording this whole film right now. So today I want to talk a little bit about the Gospel of Thomas. And I've made this early so that when we start our class on the Gospel of Thomas, everybody will have a little bit of a background. The upcoming classes will start the 9th of February, 2022, and go to the Facebook page for more detail on the Zoom link and all. And we're going to want those classes to be very organic. So after the 9th, they'll be every 2 weeks. And we'll go as long as we're still inspired to do so. I'm not going to be recording those so that people can be free to kind of share some of their ideas about the various verses as we just start going through from the beginning. So this time I'm going to get all of my slides out of the way, a little bit of background information. And if you're so inclined, you can always contact me for further data. So let's go on here. So Thomas is one of the 12 male disciples of the following of Jesus. And we know that Thomas, as a figure, was one of these because he's recorded in the list of the 12 in all 4 of the Gospels. And this is the 12 here. Now, so that we're not missing out, I want to point out that in the Gnostic Gospels, we know that while there are 12 male disciples, of course, there's also 7 female disciples. So in the world of kind of perfection, you've got 7 female, mater, female, like the 7 planets, and 12 male, such as the signs going around. So each of these male disciples becomes part of what's recorded in the Bible as part of the organizational structure of early Christianity. And we know this from the description in Luke, where each of the 12 is sent out to get 12 more followers. And each of those 12 also end up being sent out again to get 12. So that we have this structure then at the time of the second missionary expedition, where 72 pairs being 144, 12 times 12, you start seeing the pattern, are sent out again for missionary work. And we know this organization not only from Luke itself, but also from Acts, because after Judas Iscariot kills himself, one of the first points where the other disciples are worried is that we have to find somebody to take over his people. We can also think of each of these, and this is, I believe this goes back to something that Elaine Pagels wrote of years ago, where we can think of kind of this, with this sort of organization, that initially, because everything was nonverbal, that people originally maybe learned about Christianity, about the history of Christianity and Christian sayings from a school that was associated, a school or a group that was associated back to their heads. So for example, I've lost my cursor for a moment. There we go. For example, there may have been a school of Matthew, and people learned everything from that what initially it finally became written as the Gospel of Matthew. Similarly with Peter, we know that there had been a Gospel of Peter, and there's Acts of Peter. So there was this whole lineage that centered of the experience and the documentation, understanding of Christ as taught by Peter. And similarly for each of these. So one of these, of course, that we'll be talking about today is Thomas. The sort of teachings that came out of Thomas's school. Now, what do we know of Thomas from the Christian Bible? It's interesting that while Thomas is listed in all four of the Gospels, he's only really mentioned as separately in the Gospel of John. And there we have the story of the Thomas. And Peter, I want to point out that in the Epistles of the Apostles, which is a non-canonical book, not part of the Christian Bible, but in the Epistles of the Apostle, it's not only Thomas, but Peter who also doubts. So what is this all about? The story that's recorded is that after Jesus has resurrected from the dead, and he appears to the disciples. Thomas is not there. Thomas is away. And when they tell him about it later, Thomas says, I'm not going to believe this until I see this for myself. I'm not going to believe that he's actually physically resurrected until I can actually touch his body and touch where the spear had pierced him. So, of course, eventually Jesus appears to Thomas in the story, and Thomas actually touches him and believes, and he's okay. But he's a little bit chastised for this, and Jesus goes on about how blessed are those who believe, who have not had to see, who have not had to have this physical proof. Another thing we know about Thomas is that all of the Gospels are referred to as the twin. And this brings up the Sunday school question that always comes up, is whose twin was he? And that's something we're going to talk about in a little bit later, because, it's becomes an important view, especially in Gnosticism, and especially in the sort of applied Gnosticism that we strive for. Those things we can actually use in our life to bring us to ascension, to bring us to the idea of what is achieving kenosis, take us up to the high ideas. So keep that in mind. Along the line, I want to point out too that if you go and you Google Thomas's dates, there's a number of different saint days associated with the original Apostle Thomas. But in the Roman Catholic tradition, I wanted to point out that his saint day is the 21st of December, which, should start clicking in on whose twin is he. So we'll get back to that. So I save that a little bit. Okay. After Christ ascends, as recorded in Matthew, there's a tradition that all of the disciples then, since Jesus, it's recorded in Matthew that Jesus says, go forth to become disciples of all nations. So the tradition is that all of the disciples drew of like who was going to go where. And this is a little bit of kind of the traditional missions that are recorded in the hagiography being the stories of the saints that, of course, are written well after the saints are gone. But it's recorded in these about their journeys to these places. And of course, and our friend Thomas ends up in India. And we'll be talking a little bit about that later when we talk about the Acts of Thomas. But I want to give you kind of a bit of that perspective of how far out we go. Okay, so what are the Thomas scriptures? There's really about 5 different traditional sources that we have from Thomas. First is the one we're going to be talking about, which is the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas itself is really a collection of sayings that are attributed to Jesus and attributed to the saints. Now, we had known about the Gospel of Thomas because the Gospel of Thomas had been recorded in the writings of the early church father, the people who first were writing, the bishops who were first writing about Christianity in the 2nd century. So they made reference to a number of Gospels that had been lost over time. And one of those Gospels. Then beginning in, really after Napoleon's time in Egypt, archaeologists, antiquarians, etc., started to look for some of these forgotten or lost Gospels. And fragments were found along the way of Gospel. So people started having this hit that may have been out there. And then when the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945, that's when we really got what seems to be an entire collection of the Gospel of Thomas. And scholars were able to put this together as far as gospel because they had previous versions of it that were hint by hint and that they could actually lace into the Gospel of Thomas. So that's something we're going to be talking about later on. Another very Gnostic book associated with Thomas is one called the Book of Thomas the Contender, which is a very short book. And it's more philosophical. So while the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings, the Book of Thomas, it's, I think the full title is Thomas the Contender, Thomas the Athlete's, lectures for the perfect, teachings for the perfect. So in the short book of Thomas the Contender, which is also found in the Nag Hammadi, we've got more of a philosophical explanation of what's on. And I encourage people to look at that because there we start coming in with this of the twin. Then there's the Acts of Thomas, which is a later work that describes the journeys of Thomas as he goes into India. And it's a really important work because it preserves one of the probably the classic Gnostic story, which is the Hymn of the Pearl. And which one can find a number of places. Yeah, but it's an interesting book to read. Third one is more of a biography that was added on, kind of, they think in the 2nd century, which actually, when I looked this up, it surprised me that this was that early, because a lot of the infancy gospels are later. But it's a number of language and traditions. So while it's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, also talks about how, really it's a story of Jesus's infancy. It's not Thomas's, but Jesus's growing up, and kind of it gives the questions of about, kind of tries to answer the questions of okay, if Jesus was born divine, and one of the questions that bothered kind of Christian theologians, or those who think about these things, and those who worry about heresy, has been the question of was Jesus born divine, or did he become divine? And there's part of a tradition. In fact, some scholars actually say that the original the original Gospel of Mark actually recorded that the words when Jesus baptized, that the voice from God the Father comes down and says, "Today I have begotten thee," and that was the time when the Spirit of Christ, the higher Christ Spirit, enters into Jesus of Nazareth. So that view was deemed heretical in early Christianity, so then people, and they said, no, Jesus was born divine. He didn't become divine later on in his adulthood. So the Infancy Gospel of Thomas tries to address, if Jesus was born divine, what would his childhood have been like? You've got all this power, how does it manifest in a little boy as he's growing up? So it's worth a read if you've ever thought about that sort of question. The final one I added on here, and this is kind of what we know of what could have been the Gospel of Thomas, is through the Manichaean writings. And the Manichaeans were a Gnostic type group that began in the 3rd century in Persia and spread actually all the way west of the Roman Empire and all the way east into China. And they actually lasted into China until the 15th century, when they kind of merged into Taoist and Buddhist groups. But in the Manichaean teachings, there's a lot of emphasis on this concept of the heavenly twin. I'll be talking about the heavenly twin in a little bit. And so they also reference to Thomas and this sort of twin concept. So let's get to the point of this all. So the question is, who is Thomas's twin? And the answer is Jesus. It's Jesus, put it into New Age terms, it's the Christ Spirit. So when we read about the heavenly twin, we read about Thomas, we should think of ourselves as Thomas and the Christ Spirit as being our heavenly twin, our higher self. And this is part of the Acts of Thomas. This gets into some of the mystical understanding that people miss. And it relates to the idea in Gnosticism of the indwelling Christ. The Christ is within us, as kind of the Celtic saying, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ within me. There is Gnosticism. The striving for the self is often visualized as a striving for a higher self above you. And the parallel of this, within the Thomas schools and within the Manichaean school, is that part of this heavenly spirit, our heavenly twin, is there to guide us, whether it's viewed as the Christ spirit or as a spark or emanation of the Christ spirit. One can debate. So we should see the relationship between Thomas and Christ as one of twinship. And likewise, we should see our own path to ascent, path to our higher self, as coming through this sort of working as we strive for our soul to unite with our higher soul, to unite with our soul, to unite to the higher self, in this general sort of golden thread, if you would, of our place here in our own awareness going to that of the ultimate divine. And if you take away anything else, this is the key thing to take away from this talk, and something certainly to meditate on and work with. This is called out very well in the early beginnings of the writings of the book of Thomas the Contender. Let me read this out because this is really important. So the Savior said, "Brother Thomas, while you have time in the world, listen to me, and I'll reveal to you the things that you have pondered in your mind. Now, since it has been said that you are my twin and my true companion," again, this sort of heavenly relationship, divine, "examine yourself and learn who you are, and in what way you exist, and how you to be. And since you're called my brother, it's not fitting that you be ignorant of yourself. I know that you have understood because you've already understood that I am knowledge and truth. So while you accompany me, although you are uncomprehending, you have in fact already come to know, and you will be called the one who knows himself." So while Thomas was able to understand a bit of Christ as something external to himself, Christ now beckons him to recognize that it's not external to him at all, it's actually within him. "For he who has not known himself has known nothing, but he who has known himself has at the same time already achieved knowledge of the depth of all. So then, my brother Thomas, you, my brother Thomas, have beheld what is obscure to men, and what they certainly stumble against." This goes into, those who have studied a bit of classical thought will recognize that this goes back to the old Delphi idea of know thyself and plummet who you are, the self-examining, and take what has been told of the divine and recognize of how that comes into yourself. So this is kind of the, again, main point of the Thomasean schools. And it's something that is actually very esoteric. And the exoteric church, people who take these things literally don't get this. But this needs to be part of the inner understanding that once kind of understood in its fulfillment, aids in the pursuit of gnosis, bringing us to gnosis. So the key message again is Christ is my heavenly twin. Christ's energy is my heavenly twin. Let's talk a little bit about the Acts of Thomas. The Act of Thomas, again, starts off with the story that I'm just going to talk about the beginning of it all, and hopefully it will encourage you to go and find a copy for yourself. There's a number of these works are all available online. So you should start Googling the Acts of Thomas and the PDFs will start coming. So the Acts of Thomas starts there, of course, the disciples having drawn who is going where. Thomas draws a short straw where he's supposed to go to India. And Thomas does not want to go to India. So at one point, Thomas is at a harbor. And he knows he should get on the boat to go India, but he really doesn't want to. And he figures, Jesus is gone. He won't know. And there's no mass communication. Nobody's going to not know if I don't go. I could just stay away someplace more pleasant. But Jesus knows this now. So, there is a boat, of course, ready to leave for India. And part of the thing, some of the cargo that the captain has been, kind of commissioned to get, is actually to get a carpenter, because he needs some carpenter because there's this wealthy king in India is building a palace. So he's looking for a carpenter. And so Jesus, Jesus knows this. So Jesus appears. And again, we have evidence, Jesus appears and to the captain, and he tells the captain of the ship, he says, he said, hey, here you're looking for a carpenter. And the captain says, yes, I need a carpenter. I haven't been able to find one that I can take to India with me. And Jesus says, I'll tell you what, I've got a slave who is a carpenter, really good carpenter. I don't need him anymore. I'm beyond that stuff. I'll sell you the slave who's a carpenter. And, he may not want to come. So you might have to, strong arm him again. And the captain says, no problem. I got guys. I can do that. So Jesus says, now, you're going to be able to find him because he looks a lot like me. He's a slave. My father kind of daggles around, how it goes, so he looks just, and you'll find him, wandering around the harbor here, and, get him, and that will be your carpenter. So of course, Jesus vanishes, the captain and his goons go out, find Thomas, and, basically Shanghai him into the boat, and Thomas is bound to India. So we know from the story, again, Thomas, the twin of Jesus. So, the story goes on, Thomas makes it to India, and when he gets there, the king is having this large wedding party. And so Thomas is with everybody else hanging out at the wedding party, drinking, and, there's a Hebrew flute player that he kind of takes a shine to. So he's doing this. Meanwhile, so unknown to everybody. Jesus has appeared to the married couple. So the next morning, the married couple, they get down, they meet their parents, and they announce that they've converted to Christianity, and they've both taken vows of celibacy. Well, it doesn't go down well with the parents who are looking for grandchildren. They're looking for heirs to solidify their union and everything else. So they're really upset about this conversion, but mostly about the celibacy. And they're like, well, who put these ideas in your head? Now, Jesus, of course, when he appeared in the form of Thomas. So Thomas then gets identified as the culprit behind this all, behind this conversion of polluting the minds of the wedding couple and turning them into Christian and celibacy. So Thomas gets thrown into jail. And it's when he's in jail that one of the other prisoners asks him why he's in jail, and Thomas tells him the story, and he says, well, what is this faith you have? Tell me about your faith. And at that point, Thomas tells the story of the hymn of the pearl. And the hymn, when we see these references to the pearl throughout the other gospels as well, there's that Jesus talks about the parable of finding a pearl of great price. So the pearl itself, I'm going to paraphrase it just now. So there's longer versions and shorter versions you can find online. So the hymn of pearl starts that when I was a young man, I was happy in my Father's kingdom. And I lived in a large house with my mother and my father, and I had fine robes of glory. And everything was beautiful and lovely and wonderful. But then one day, my parents come to me and they say, tell me, it's time for you to go on your mission. We need you go to a mission and to retrieve the pearl of great glory, the wonderful pearl, and it's being hidden in a faraway place and guarded by a dragon. But you need to do this. Go on this mission, retrieve the pearl, and then you come back here. So I leave my Father's kingdom. And I make my way down, and I find myself going toward Egypt and going dark, 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 far away along into this remote land. And as I get to the remote land, I find somebody from my own kingdom, and he tells me, when you get to the land, don't eat the food, don't drink their drinks, otherwise you'll lose who you are. But when I was in this other land, I became lonely and tired and weak. So I ate the food of that land, and I drank the drinks. And pretty soon I became like one drunk. And I forgot my mission. I forgot about the pearl. I forgot about my Father's kingdom. And I found myself just living like someone in a trance, not really knowing who I was or what my mission was. And so I go on, not knowing who I am. But my Father somehow sensed this, and he sent a messenger to me, a messenger with a letter, and the messenger arrived and I saw the message, and I read it, and suddenly, with that messenger, I remembered who I was. I remembered of my globes of glory. I remembered my mission to find the pearl. So with this knowledge strengthened, I took myself to the cave, and I slew the dragon, and I got the pearl of glory, and I made it back home to my father's land. And when I was back at my father's land, and I had retrieved the pearl, my father was there, my mother was there, my brother, and they all welcomed me. And they put again on my cloak of glory. I was happy and whole again. So the story, of course, is about the descent of the soul. It's about how we often go through life forgetting who we are. There's a term in some of the Gnostic scriptures. They use a term, not generally use the term, also they'll say knowledge, or they'll use the term acquaintance. That we're not acquainted, that we don't even know who we are. We're someone else. We're just kind of, people are going through the motion, and we certainly know people like that, and maybe like we've even felt like we're just there at some point in our life. So the goal in Gnosticism is to wake up. Is to wake up and remember who you are. Remember that you are a divine being, and remember that your mission here is to become acquainted again with yourself, and to become then, by being acquainted with yourself and your own soul, you become acquainted with divine. And the more you understand yourself, your soul, divine, the greater and the greater the world becomes, and the greater your aura, your cloak of glory becomes around you. So that's where, it's so many in the Gnostic scriptures, and even in the Bible, New Testament, you'll see the word "wake up," and that is what this is about. Wake up and become aware. Achieve to that sense of knowing and becoming. And this goes into seers from all time talk about this. Jacob Bema, who was 16th century, 17th century maybe, German mystic. And one of the things he would say in some of his books, he says, "Oh, you poor half-dead, you've forgotten who you are." And that's it, that we need to remember who we are. And that's the story of the Hymn of the Pearl. Also in the Acts of Thomas, they go through the words of institution as he describes a Christian Mass, Christian Eucharist. And we still use some of those words in our Gnostic Mass today. And then there is a lot of other things. There's actually a talking donkey at one part, really understand, but it would be interesting to really take that concept of the talking donkey with like the whole thing of Apuleius' the golden ass in his Metamorphosis, and look at these sort of parallel ways of the donkey, of these talking donkeys, and look and see what's behind that all. But I'm getting distracted. So this is the Acts of Thomas, which gives us a bit more of some of these sort of awarenesses. Okay, back a little bit, just as some more detail. I'm not going to go into the Manichaean stuff because that's a whole big other thing. I think it's enough to say that the Manichaeanism was founded by Mani, and Mani has he even before he has a visitation from his heavenly twin, from the heavenly twin, who really instructs him onto that he should go and create this world religion that brings together, Christianity, the Zoroastrian, the Judaism, all of this together. And it adapts. One of the successes of Manichaeism is that it kind of transforms and takes on more of the color. And Mani, writing in the middle of the 3rd century, even he talks about Buddhism. He talks about Christianity. He says that Christ and the Buddha are one. There's just different emissaries. There's just different luminaries for different times, for different cultures, but it's all one. And enough said there. Going to go off to Manichaeism, but again, it was his working with the heavenly twin. Heavenly twin, for those familiar with Platonism and theurgy, the heavenly twin is can be synonymous to the Agrabathena, the good demon, the guardian angel, if you would, but not quite guardian angels. It's thought in most modern things that we tell children, but it's really kind of the higher self. So anyway, let's get back to Gospel of Thomas here. So we had, as I mentioned earlier, we had fragments of the Gospel of Thomas from various sources. And then the full source was found in the Nag Hammadi library. The Nag Hammadi was this cache trove of scriptures that had been buried but were discovered in 1945 and contained a large number of Gnostic material. It also contains some of the works of Plato, and that thought to be probably have been buried during the 3rd or 4th century. There was a number of movements during that time that were rather anti-scholarism, and also there was movements, anti-heretical movements, that would have meant that these had been buried to be preserved from another point. Real cache trove and has completely expanded what we know about Gnosticism. So the Gospel of Thomas, as the researchers have looked at it, we can find the dates all over the place of how old is it. The general consensus is that it's quite old, maybe 2nd century, though there are scholars who would move it even earlier into the 1st century. Thomas comes in as, what is the source for the Gospel of Thomas? A couple things was, as scholars had looked at saying okay, when they compare, there's 4, let me back up a minute. For those who are unfamiliar with the Christian Bible, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament being prior to Jesus and the kind of the Hebrew Judaism is considered to be the Old Testament. New Testament start with the 4 Gospels that are written they're written about the kind of the mission and life of Jesus itself. And then there are letters, mostly letters from Paul. But there's also some letters from Jude and John in that. So when scholars have looked at which are these authentic, why do these gospels somewhat differ in that? There was the kind of the general theory was that, okay, when they look at the gospels, realizing that The oldest one out of the four Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was probably Mark. Mark is the simplest. Mark just starts at the baptism of Jesus and at the resurrection. So there's not much else fluff around the outside of it. And also because things are replicated from in Matthew and Luke, it looks as if they actually knew about Mark prior to it, as well as maybe John as well. So, but there are things that are also in Matthew and Luke and John that are not in Mark. I mentioned earlier about the story of Thomas. That's in John and not in these other Gospels. So scholars had two things that are really kind of relevant to this discussion. One was they thought, as they were reading this, of like, what would be, if there was like an original book, what would this look like? And one of the consensus is, well, probably the original book wouldn't really have much for biography or history. It would probably just be the sayings of Jesus. Just, collected sayings. So, and of course, Thomas fits that very well, because Thomas is just this collection of sayings. So whether or not, so then there was this idea that there was maybe an original gospel that these other ones come from, and that may have been Q. So some scholars have thought that Thomas itself may have also been using Q of this original one, maybe not. And I'd recommend books such as The Gospel of Thomas by Elaine Pagels, or some of these other more scholarly work if you're really interested in these sorts of things. When we read the Gospels, if you're familiar with the work of Plotinus or some of the other Platonists of the first, second, third century, you'll find a lot of similarities, some almost verbatim. And so this appears that Thomas was either known by them or some of these Platonic ideas had started there by the time that Thomas is written down. It could also be that whoever wrote down Thomas was also really familiar with probably really familiar with a lot of the Greek philosophy. But having said that, it's a kind of an open question of how much of Thomas was written originally in Greek or was in Aramaic, which would have been the language of Jesus. So this stuff all gets really complicated, and if you're really interested, something to be dealt with, there are books on this that one can follow through. But there are these sort of lineages around it. And anybody have any more questions, we can always discuss this. I think this gives the kind of the background we need to know for Thomas. Really, we want to get a copy of this going forward. We can, you can find sources of the Gnostic scriptures and the Gospel of Thomas online at gnosis.org. There's also some sacred texts. There's other places where you can download it. Other sources are, of course, a copy of the Nag Hammadi library itself. The earliest one, and probably still one of the best ones, was edited by James Robinson. A similar collection of Nag Hammadi scriptures is by Bentley Layton, called the Gnostic Scriptures. Largely contains a lot of Nag Hammadi material, maybe a little bit extra, a few odds and ends of things. I like Bentley Layton's because he has maps in it, and in larger, more kind of a description, but both of these have nice descriptions of the kind of the source material and little summaries of the various books of the Nag Hammadi before you get in there. And they both have copies of Thomas in their entirety. There's lots of other books out there on the Gospel of Thomas at this time, so go ahead and check them out. I think it's really good to read it in the original. And before we start our classes, it would be good to have a copy locally. If you can't afford really a hard copy, download something from gnosis.org or one of the other websites. And finally, if it's too much to be reading, or you're not much of a reader and you just plan to just kind of wing it as you come to the class, there's a wonderful film out about the Gospel of Thomas called Stigmata, which is kind of fun. But the Gospel of Thomas as being this sort of secret gospel is used in the background of this. So it's fun thing to kind of watch if you want to get yourself prepped for going forward. So that's it. And I hope you can join us for when we start our classes on the 9th, be at 7 p.m. here in Greenwich Mean Time here in Britain, and we'll try to have a copy of it downloaded, or have a hard copy available, because I'm going to try to get rid of the slides so that we're more communicative and more interactive. So if that's there, be blessed, be safe, and meditate on your heavenly twin. Bye.